and welcome to Lesson 12 of this Elizabeth I GCSE lesson series. This lesson is going to focus on relations with Spain, and the track that you have just been played in by was called Sunday Fiesta. So you need to turn to the Lesson 12 page in your lesson notes booklet. You will find the lesson 12 on page 6 of that booklet, and you will find the booklet either on class charts or on pod, or it will have been sent to you directly, or failing all of that, there will be a link to it in the description at the bottom of this video, and you can download it from that link. So let's get ready to go. Okay, we're going to start with a smart task, which asks you to think about what you already know about the problems that Elizabeth had in her relationship with the Spanish. Some of this is a recap from the end of last lesson, but some of it is a recap back to lesson 6. So in the space provided in your lesson notes booklet, or just on a separate piece of paper, write down everything you can remember about the problems that Elizabeth had in her relationship with Spain that we've looked at so far. Off you go. Okay, welcome back. So this is the page from the textbook that you would have seen during lesson 6 when you're doing some initial work on the relationship with Spain. And a lot of the problems that Elizabeth encountered in her relationship with Spain centered around the Spanish Netherlands, which was the major trading partner for England. A lot of the wool that was produced in England went sent to the cloth houses in the Netherlands, and there was a lot of contact between the English and the Spanish Netherlands. And when the Dutch revolted against the Spanish, then that put Elizabeth in a tricky position. And so she had to decide what her level of involvement was going to be. She wanted to help the Dutch rebels. She wanted to help them as Protestants against a Catholic power, but she also didn't want to compromise the trading relationship with that region in case the Spanish, as they did at one point, placed a trade embargo between England and the Spanish Netherlands, which hurt the English economy. So we know that long-term issue of the Spanish Netherlands. We also know from last week, or last lesson, sorry, you might have done it last week. We know from last lesson that there were increasing problems over religion and Catholic powers trying to plot to overthrow Elizabeth. We know that the Spanish were involved in some ways in the Throckmorton and the Babington plot, and we know that Philip was annoyed, to say the least, at the execution of Mary Queen of Scots, and that was another source of tension between Elizabeth and the Spanish. So we now turn to this fella, Sir Francis Drake, the leading pirate of the Elizabethan age, a entrepreneur, a pirate, a navigator. He was responsible for causing a lot of tension between the Spanish and the English, and a lot of this was done at the direction of Elizabeth. She gave him secret instructions to do things which really antagonized the Spanish and helped the relationship between England and Spain to deteriorate. You're going to watch a clip in a moment which talks about Francis Drake's circumnavigation of the globe, and you are then going to read some information in your lesson notes book, and you're going to complete the table on page 7, which looks an awful lot like that. It asks you to think about Drake's voyage around the world and his piracy, and it asks you to consider two things. Reasons that he annoyed the Spanish, so things that he did which would have annoyed the Spanish, and also the significance and importance of his voyage, so the wider significance of it in terms of economic wealth, in terms of the money that he brought back for the English crown, in terms of the prestige that it brought, and also in terms of the expansion of English horizons and the development or certainly the beginning of the development of some sort of British or English empire. I don't have copyright permission to use the clip here, so you'll have to follow the link which is here and in your booklet to watch the clip. You should have got plenty that you can start to put into that table based on what you've just watched. You also need to use the excerpts from the textbook that are on the pages after page 7, where you have this table in your lesson notes booklet. So pause this now, fill in that table using what you've just heard in the video and also the excerpts from the textbook in your lesson notes booklet as well. Okay, off you go. Okay then, so what you should have got there in terms of reasons why he annoyed the Spanish, well, take your pick. He is raiding their Pacific and Atlantic coast empires. He is stealing loads and loads and loads of treasure from the Spanish Empire. He is sinking their ships. He is taking their treasure. And just to compound it all, when he returns home with the Golden Hind and he sails into Plymouth, he is knighted by Elizabeth. Now, Elizabeth gave him this secret mission to go around and raid the Spanish Empire, which then turned into a circumnavigation of the globe. That was supposed to be secret, so I guess there was some element to which Philip of Spain could think that Drake was acting on his own initiative and that Elizabeth didn't necessarily direct him to do this. However, when she knights him, when he comes back and gives sort of official seal of approval effectively to what he's done, then that particularly riles the Spanish. So Drake's activities are particularly antagonistic towards the Spanish, and they are particularly responsible for the deterioration of the relationship between England and Spain. In terms of the wider significance of his circumnavigation of the globe, well, he's the first Englishman to do it, so that's pretty impressive. The prestige that that brings is pretty important, but also he brings back a shed load of cash and treasure. So, at a time when the economy in England was not entirely stable, as we'll see later on, lessons to do with poverty in England. A lot of the economic fortunes of the country were tied to the wool market and the cloth market. At a time when there was some economic uncertainty, bringing all of that cash back and all of that treasure was really important economically. So, Sir Francis Drake, very, very important in the sort of wider significance of the growing English or British Empire and the growing influence of England in the world, but also a massive source of antagonism we come in the relationship between major Spain source of tension and England, which is the Spanish Netherlands. We have here some information which is a bit of a recap of what the relationship with the Spanish Netherlands was in the 1560s before we look ahead to the 1570s and 1580s. We know that Philip II was a strict Catholic and Spain controlled the Netherlands. We know that in the 1563 he banned the import of English cloth because he thought English merchants were spreading Protestantism. We know the Dutch didn't like the tight Spanish control, and that the Dutch revolt that broke out in 1566 was brutally put down by the Duke of Albert with an army of 10,000 men in 1567, and by 1569 the Dutch rebellion had been defeated. Dutch rebels called sea beggars attacked Spanish ships in the Channel, and Elizabeth allowed them to harbour in English ports, so she's signalling her sympathy with their plight. In 1568, Spanish ships carrying gold to pay Alva's troops sought shelter in English ports from the sea beggars. The money was a loan to Philip from bankers in Genoa, Italy. Elizabeth took the gold for herself. which was known as the Genoese loan. And you can imagine this really annoyed the Spanish. So Elizabeth's trying to avoid some sort of all-out war in the 1560s with the Spanish, and this continues with her attempts to avoid some sort of all-out conflict. But she's also sticking her nose into the Dutch situation, and she's trying to make sure that she stays on good terms with the Dutch because she needs to for trade purposes. But she's walking a tightrope here between protecting English interests, supporting Protestantism, but also really annoying Philip of Spain. So what we're going to turn to now is how this tightrope walking foreign policy of Elizabeth in relation to the Spanish Netherlands developed in the 1570s and 1580s. You will see on page 10 of your lesson notes booklet that you have this information about Elizabeth's involvement with the Spanish Netherlands in the 1570s and 1580s. And you are about to see the way in which she became increasingly involved to the point of direct involvement in the 1580s, where she sent English troops, over 7,000 of them, to try and help the Dutch rebels against the Spanish. So you'll see on page 11 of your lesson notes book that it asks you to identify from this information some successes of Elizabeth's policy and also some failures of her policy. So if you pause this now, read the information. You can either pause it and read it off the screen here, or you can read it in your lesson notes booklet and jot down the successes of her policy and the failure of her policy. Okay, welcome back. Now, to be fair, it's probably the case that it's difficult to find many successes. There is a moment here in the 1576 and the Spanish Fury and the pacification of Ghent when the Spanish have to give in to the Dutch provinces' demands, and Elizabeth has given them some money and she's supporting them, and it seems like they've achieved what they wanted to achieve. But then 6 months later, Philip changes his mind, sends an army, and gets control of the Netherlands again. The expeditionary force under John Casimir is a complete failure. Then the Duke of Alençon dies, and William of Orange is assassinated, and in 1585 the King of France has basically signed up to rid his country of Protestantism, so Spain and France are on each other's side. They're Catholic allies, which is seriously bad news for Elizabeth as the only Protestant force left in Europe. And when in 1585 Elizabeth sends a force of English soldiers under the command of Robert Dudley to help the Dutch rebels, she has effectively declared war on the Spanish, and the clock is ticking down to the Spanish Armada sailing into the Channel to try and invade England. And that brings us to the end of the lesson. The last question at the end of this lesson is, why were there such tensions between England and Spain? Well, there were such tensions between England and Spain because they were emerging as the most powerful forces in Europe. And they're emerging as the most powerful forces when one of them is Protestant and one of them is Catholic. So there's a religious dimension to this rivalry, but there's also an economic and political dimension to it. And the economic dimension can be seen in both the Spanish Netherlands, with the English trying to maintain trade there, Philip trying to hamper that, but also in the growing empires of both countries and the piracy and Sir Francis Drake's activities trying to take money off the Spanish, trying to get access to the new resources in the New World. And there's also a political element to it here of powerful Catholic forces versus powerful Protestant forces. It's about who has political dominance and who has control over Europe and who has influence. So, this leads us nicely into the next lesson, and that next lesson is going to be about the Spanish Armada, and that is Philip's attempt to try and deal with Elizabeth and to try and win in his conflict against her. And so that brings us to the end of lesson 12 on the relations with Spain. And the next lesson will focus on the sending of the Spanish Armada. What's about to play us out is a track called Rain in Spain, and it brings a sense of foreboding ahead of the Armada. Until next time, see you later.